Welcome to Leading with Faith, a podcast where we explore faith, leadership, and the journey that connects them. I'm Dr. Kristi Kirk, and I serve as president of Concordia University, Texas, and I'm excited to welcome you to this conversation today. I pray that through these conversations, you are challenged to lead with faith in your own vocational callings. All right, I am very excited to welcome two special guests today, friends of mine and friends of Austin, really, and we'll tell that story in a few minutes. But I'd like to introduce Kirsta Melton and Peter Croft. Peter, why don't you get us started and tell us who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, Peter Croft from the United Kingdom. I've been in Austin for 11 years now, believe it or not. So I was supposed to be here for 6 months. I came here to do business school. There's a business school called Acton School of Business. It's the only place in the world I could find that was focused on entrepreneurship. So all the teachers are entrepreneurs, everything's entrepreneurship focused. And maybe we'll get into this later, but my call about 12, 13 years ago was towards entrepreneurship. And so that's why I came here. And I stayed because I met my wife, and now I have 3 Texan boys. So you never know what's going to happen in the world. I've helped run and grow various businesses in Austin over the past decade. And about 2 years ago, I kind of had a transition period. Again, maybe we'll get into this more later if it's helpful for others. But what I do now is I work with leadership teams of mainly businesses. I have a couple nonprofits, and I work with them to essentially run better organizations.
Yeah, love it. It's good. So, we're going to come back to the question of the day, which is really how you bring your Christian faith into that work. We'll come back to that in a minute. Great. But I want to hear Kirsta's story first.
My story is that I'm a prosecutor. So I've been a prosecutor for pretty much my entire career, about 24 years. I currently am the founder and CEO of Institute to Combat Trafficking, where I work with DA's offices, with law enforcement, and with communities focused on identifying their risk for human trafficking, preventing human trafficking, and then actually working on cases, both the development of investigations of people involved in human trafficking and then those prosecutions of individuals who have engaged in trafficking.
Hard work. And you've just published a book about human trafficking?
I have. We've just published a book called Human Trafficking Investigation, A Practitioner's Guide to Making the Case.
Yeah. The 3 of us were in an event a week or so ago, and I got to hear you tell kind of the story of the book, and it's a fascinating story. But as I told you, what really struck me in that, and certainly already knew this about you, is that you are tackling one of the hardest challenges of today's world, where people have been so abused and mistreated and experiencing sort of the worst of the world. And you enter into that space, certainly with knowledge as a prosecutor and expertise and knowing how to work the systems to provide care, but you also do that as a Christian in the world, and you do that from a faith-based place. Talk about kind of that, what drives you in terms of your faith story to be involved in this really messy stuff?
I think for me it is that inside of me, God has placed a desire for justice and to see justice done here. And while we know that justice will not always be done on earth, there is a call for us to act justly, and in my particular space, to seek accountability for those who have been hurt, who have been injured, who have been exploited, and who have been wronged. And so my view of prosecution and my walk in that space has been focused around that call of seeking justice. And so that's not just justice for the victim, but that is justice within the system. So that is seeking justice for the defendant and also for the community. Because I don't think that there can be wholeness or healing without justice. Because there is that part of you that will always say, this wrong has happened and there needs to be a right to it. And ultimately that right will not come, right, until Jesus comes back. Yeah. But there is a space and there is a call for that throughout Scripture for us to do justly.
Right.
And so that's where my faith connects with my work.
I love that. We just opened on campus our Center for Belonging and Faith, and we're having a series this fall that we have Faith Plus series and a Belonging Plus series. And yesterday our conversation was Faith and Justice with Jen Cumberbatch, and she hit on so many of the same themes that you do. Mm-hmm. And what a driving, compelling force that is that our Christian identity compels us to seek justice for those around us. And you're right, justice is often tampered by our own human desires and motives, and yet there's this beautiful opportunity to seek restorative justice that mirrors what God would have us do. So thank you for doing that work. I can only imagine the stories and that you're just in the messiness of life in that work. So thank you. Peter, hopefully your work isn't quite that messy and maybe it is sometimes. But I certainly, as I've gotten to know you, know that you bring your own stories of faith to your work. And it is just essential to how you approach this work of coaching leadership teams and helping businesses, particularly entrepreneurial businesses, thrive.
Yeah.
In your own words, how do you talk about your faith journey and how it impacts your work?
So let me tell you about how I got into this. Because really, I had no interest in business. I was a school teacher in England. I taught in boarding schools. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I enjoyed. If you've seen Harry Potter, the kind of Hogwarts situation.
Yes. Dead Poet Society is coming to mind for me.
Bit of an East Coast equivalency there.
Okay.
So for me, I was in Virginia, long story, for a year, and I met entrepreneurs who were the pillars of the community. They were providing meaningful work for people. They were beacons of light. They were good people. And I'd not really seen that before, to be honest. I hadn't been exposed to that. So and I read a book called Why Business Matters to God by Jeff Van Duzer. I was involved at the University of Virginia, vaguely, with some people there. And my whole theology of work and business changed. And so for me, as soon as I saw that and I realized that entrepreneurs are cultural gatekeepers. They have outsized influence in the world. They really change culture in a lot of ways. Market capitalism, for all its inadequacies, is a very powerful force. These people are at the vanguard of that. And I thought, how do I get involved? And so that led me to South Carolina, another long story, and then eventually to Austin. But so to answer your question, this was a journey that I didn't expect, I didn't seek, but it was a calling towards making an impact through business. And so everything I do is with that lens. And so, I've noticed a decade in Austin working in different businesses that it's not perfect. And I haven't figured it out, by the way, but I want to see, in a sense, the power of business kind of enhanced and magnified. And so at the heart of that is the entrepreneur, and I want to support the entrepreneur. So it's a kind of theme, it's DNA in everything that I do. I can get into that more, but that's the essence of it.
So go a little deeper there, Peter, in terms of what, how your faith drives you to that. I think you touched on some of those, and you and I have had some conversations around this, but where is God's call in that for you?
A well-run business has a huge positive impact. So the Jeff Van Duzer book, here's what I think's been messed up. And it's a big claim, and I don't expect everyone to believe me, but the purpose of business isn't to make money, I believe. I believe it is to provide meaningful work for people, which is very important. People need a purpose, and they get most of their time spent in the workplace. Sorely not always the case. In fact, very rarely the case that people feel like their work is meaningful, but it is. And secondly, the goods and services that community needs for flourishing. I mean, can you, if I gave you 55 cents and said, hey, can you take this letter to Alaska? I mean, would you do it? Of course not. I mean, but the system allows us, as broken as it is, the opportunity to do that sort of thing. So I want to celebrate, and I want to encourage the entrepreneur. For what they do is really important. In fact, you could say the fate of nations depends in part on how they view the entrepreneur. And so I want to affirm them in that work. I want to support them in that work. I mean, I read something this morning. Entrepreneurs are 2 times more likely to get depression and 6 times more likely to get ADHD. I mean, the suffering, the risks that they take, the suffering that they go through, the stress, the sleepless nights. I mean, I've been there, and it's hard. And so I want to affirm that. But I also kind of want to have a small part in reframing what that purpose of business should be, and how much of an opportunity entrepreneurs have.
You know what I love about that is you're using different words, but I think you're describing exactly what Kirsta did, right? In a very, you're seeking justice in our own work lives and our own meaningful work. And I love that you use that phrase. Concordia has a vision to be the place where faith, learning, and life-changing experiences leads to meaningful work. And so that's what we, that is our stated vision statement for all of our students, that when they graduate from Concordia, that they don't just get a job. Yes, education should lead towards career, but they don't really just want a job. They really want meaningful work. And there is something God-given deep in our souls that calls us to look for meaning, and meaning that provides justice in the world. And so you're talking more kind of economic justice and others rather than kind of the legal system justice. And yet God has this deep fundamental calling at all of us to do that.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
It's broken.
Yeah.
There's lots of work to do.
Yes.
And I haven't figured it out.
Yeah, there are no shortage of places for Christians to seek to provide justice in the world, is there? I love it as a call from God. I mentioned our students then. What advice would you give to students who are at that stage of their career where they're kind of figuring out meaningful work, figuring out how they can do good in the world to provide justice in the world? What advice would you give to students in that phase of life? And maybe we're all in that phase of life in one way or another.
I would say that's the truth, right?
Yes.
Because I think you're constantly reevaluating
sure.
where you're meant to be, what you're meant to be doing.
Yes,
And so, one, don't be afraid of those questions, and don't think that if you answer them one time, that's where you're locked into for the rest of your life. So I think you've got to be willing to take risks like Peter is talking about, trying out things, seeing where your bent is, where your giftings are, and where you feel most blessed and most able to give blessing through your work.
Yeah.
I would say that's one thing. I'd say that another thing is make a pattern from the beginning of when God gives you opportunity to share your faith, of sharing your faith. Because if you get in that pattern, you will find that God opens up opportunities throughout your career. There have been times as a prosecutor when I have literally been able to reach across my desk and say, hey, would you be okay if I prayed for you? These are people that I'm meeting in the course of my work. They're there to interview with me and get ready for a trial and talk about some of the really hard things that they have gone through. And they need to know that there are people there who can speak truth into their life. And is that part of my job? No. My job was working as a prosecutor in a particular case or particular county. But there are times when you hear that inside of you that it is time. And I've never had somebody say no.
Yeah.
And I've never had somebody be angry when I have said, hey, I'm praying for you, or I'd like to pray for you right now. I had a case involving a young woman who was abused by a pastor in her church. And there had been a great deal of frankly, wrong behavior on the part of the church. And at one point, I had to just say to her, I want to apologize for Christians, for the church, for not standing for what is right, and for not doing what was right to protect you as a child in that space. And it allowed us to move forward, and it allowed the trial for her to be a much more transformative experience than it would have been otherwise. So I would say to your students, become comfortable in sharing. It's sometimes scary, it's sometimes hard, but God will give you those opportunities at times that you really aren't anticipating or thinking about.
I just love that because it is so indicative of how God works in the world, right? As we are His hands and feet, or as we are His voice in spaces where His voice might not be allowed. Not that He can prevent His voice from being there, but we get to show up and we get to do our work, do it well, do it excellently. But we also get to bring a spirituality, a sense of who Christ is into those spaces as well, and that's our calling as Christians, whether we work in secular or sacred spaces, right? Peter, how about you? What advice would you give?
This is a lot to say. I mean, maybe from what I said earlier, it's easy to sort of think this was a call and it was really clear and it was obvious. No. And I'm still, like you said, Kirsta, we're kind of figuring it out. But it took me 10 years, of that whole decade that I was working in business, very grateful for the opportunities, for the failures, for the successes. But I never felt this is where I'm meant to be. Like, I felt the call to entrepreneurship, but not in these situations. And so looking back, probably would have been a bit more grateful for that pain and the suffering, because it shapes you and it forms you. But also, it's a process, right? I actually, there was a point where, I said 2 years ago, I kind of transitioned to what I'm doing now. And I have to be honest, before that transition period, I kind of lost hope a little bit that it was possible to kind of do what you enjoy and add value and be good at it and make money. I thought, you can't do all those things. And you can, because that's what I'm doing now. Really believe in what I'm doing. I think it's really important. I can make decent money from doing it, and it fits with my value system. So, but the process wasn't easy. And so I think when you surrender to the Lord's will, things get a lot easier. And so it's easy to build your career. No, seek first the kingdom, and then you'll be fine. Like, it's really quite simple if we actually read the scriptures and do what it says. A lot of the pain and suffering that I've experienced, I could have avoided if I just had a consistent pattern of surrender.
Right.
So that's the most important thing. There's a lot more to say.
Peter, you used a phrase a few minutes ago. You said theology of work, and I think that's such an important and perhaps underdeveloped theology of the church today. And yet we know work is God-given, work is sacred, work happened in Eden before the fall. It is not a product of the fall. It is a gift of God given in the perfect realm. And would love to hear from both of you, and we'll talk about the Austin Center for Faith and Work here in a minute, but who has helped shape you in your own faith development, but also in your development of this sort of theology of work? Were there particular mentors, faith figures in your life who helped you along this path?
For me, it was my parents. Both my father was both a defense attorney and a prosecutor for the Air Force, and my mom has been in journalism and public relations her entire life. But both of them are strong believers, and they both very much. There was never a separation of their faith and their work. So I grew up with my mom telling me stories about my dad and the way he used his interactions with clients, both when he was a defense attorney and when he was a prosecutor. Prosecutors don't have clients. We work for the state, but nonetheless, we are constantly interacting with people, and particularly with victims in cases. And so he used those opportunities to share when God called him to do that. And that was just something I grew up hearing and knowing, and my mom the same way. And it didn't matter whether she worked for a Christian hospital or whether she worked for a secular bank, or whether she worked for Sammy Tippett Ministries, right? Throughout, her faith was integral to her work. So for me, it was very much like how we grew up, and we knew that our work was part of our calling and of our purpose, and therefore of who we were in Christ. And so I would say that. Now, at work, I would actually tell you that I had a chief at the Bexar County District Attorney's Office whose compassion for her people in the work that we did, because we were in the Family Justice and Victim Protection Unit, so we handled child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, adult sex cases, family violence from assault to capital murder. So the way she treated us, the way that she integrated our families into our workspace, and the way that she loved the victims that we served was compelling. And there was just a gentleness and a kindness and a sense of quiet, calm, and support that you knew was there from your boss. And that was powerful. And so Catherine Babbitt, for me, also exhibited in my personal professional realm
Right.
what I would want to see from a believer in that space.
I love that, back to advice to students. Some of it is find mentors, find people that you want to emulate. And then also is be a mentor. Know that
Correct.
people are watching you, particularly if you're open about your faith in this kind of post-Christian America that we live in. People are watching how we live out our faith. And I love those words you said, that our love was evidence, this sort of a calmness, a sense of peace was evidence, right? Those things become apparent to people who are watching us and give us opportunity then to tell the story of faith and why we approach the work that way, right? How about for you?
God's blessed me.
Yes.
God's
amen.
blessed me with, like, the clearest thing in my life that he's blessed me with is good people at the right times. And so there's just so many. As I said, I was in Virginia for a year, and I had the chance to really explore what it looks like to be in the marketplace and live out your faith. And that was a deliberate program that I went through. And so that's where I got exposed to Jeff Van Duzer, Why Business Matters to God, that I mentioned earlier. James Davidson Hunter at the University of Virginia. He wrote a book called To Change the World. I got to chat with him a few times. Don't agree with everything in that book, but it was very foundational. And here's kind of what I learned from teaching ethics for many years. We learn through example, kind of like what you're saying. We learn from vignettes, from stories. And so one of the things that other people are doing fantastically, and I want to add to, is to raise up people, and this is what the Center for Faith and Work does, is to provide those exemplars, right? None of us are perfect, but to show that there's a different way of doing things. And so that's how we learn, through stories. And so, I've got a few heroes in the business world and outside the business world, but it's important to collect more of those.
Yeah, for sure. Again, advice, young people, if you're listening, collect people that you emulate. I love that as a great expression of how God uses other people in our lives, for sure. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the center then. That's where the three of us met, along with some other really cool people that you should all get to meet. And so the work of the center, how would you describe it in a nutshell? And how'd you get plugged in, and how do you describe what's happening there?
This has been, so what I do is I help implement a system called EOS, which is called the Entrepreneurial Operating System. It's a framework for small businesses. Very powerful. And the reason I did that is because I was thinking, what's the biggest leverage I could do with organizations in terms of them having an impact, right? Most organizations aren't run very well. It's not easy to do that. It's one of the hardest things someone can do. This framework provides that simple execution plan of how to do it. It kind of simplifies the moving pieces of running an organization. So very powerful. But there's always this other piece that is on the faith side, right? And I think there's integration there. Mm-hmm. But I've been asking that question for 12 years. What does it look like to run a business in line with kingdom values and with a kingdom impact? And so I've been to all the different groups. I've been looking for these people for 10 plus years in Austin. And I came across Steve Tang, who started the center about a year ago, through my coach, who lives in Pittsburgh. And she's like, "You've got to meet this guy, Steve Tang." I'm like, "How do I not?" I met Steve. We hit it off. Realized we're on the same. He was way ahead of me in terms of thinking on this. I'm like, "How did I not know this guy? We know all the same people." So the truth is, I just wanted to be around him. And then the vision that he has of providing those exemplars, and I think the stated purpose is for people to do work as God intended. And so there's a lot to that. Yeah. But me specifically in the business world, this is something that I feel like I've been burdened with. And what's my role in this conversation? Burdened in a positive way. And so that's why I'm involved.
Yeah, I love that. And Kirsta, maybe you can reflect on this. Burdened in a positive way is a great description, right? Because in our conversations, when we gather as the Nexus community, we certainly talk a lot about a burden for the city, specifically when God calls us, he calls us to specific locations, right? And I say this about Concordia a lot. We are called to Austin, Texas, and to be a light and an influence and a change agent in this place. And it might look different if we were in a different place, but there's part of that. And so one of the focuses of the city is really praying for Austin and engaging in Austin and trying to be God's hands and feet, seeking the peace and prosperity of the city. Kirsta, tell your connection to the center and how you kind of resonate with that concept of for the city.
So I think one of the things that the Center for Faith and Work often starts with the focus is on business. So for me, when I was asked to kind of be a part of it, I was like, oh, I'm not businessy, right? I'm public policy-y. I'm criminal justice-y. But I think my connection and what I found that's been super powerful and valuable from it is the fact that it brings together people of so many different backgrounds and people who are in different spheres.
Yes.
And oftentimes we're in our own sphere, and that's the only sphere that we're in because that's what we're working hard on, and that's what we're called to be in. And we don't always recognize that we need to connect and to collaborate with these other spheres for everything to truly flourish and fall into place in the way that it does. So a good friend of mine once said, in the fight against human trafficking, it's not, the traffickers aren't necessarily our worst enemy. We are. It's our dysfunction. It's our inability to pull it together and to move forward in the way that we know that we should. And I think oftentimes when you look at the city, any city, whether that's Austin or somewhere else, you see the dysfunction, you see the problems, you see all of these issues. And I think one point of the Center for Faith and Work and particularly the Nexus group is to say, okay, we see that, but where can we also see good that's in that space? And where can we encourage the good that is in that space? And where can we highlight that and strengthen it and call it out and duplicate it and raise up other leaders who can be a part of that. And so for me, it is the diversity of the group that's really powerful and allows me to constantly learn from other people. And that's going to make me better in what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. My connection, I've only been involved for a handful of months now, but Tony Burdett from UFCU, or formerly, I guess, CEO of UFCU, now retired, invited me, and it made those introductions to Steve and TJ and others, and what a blessing it has been to do exactly what you described, Kirsta. It's connecting with people that maybe our paths have crossed, maybe they have not, and yet we approach the work from a common sense of calling. Mm-hmm. We approach the work of a common sense of justice, and so many of those similarities as Christians who are working in Austin, Texas, and want to see shalom for the city. What a blessing that's been. So shout out, little commercial for the center. If you're not familiar with them, please go to their website and check out the work that they're doing. If you're interested in learning more about kind of a theology of work and how it plays out in your own workforce, your own workplace, check them out, and lots of great resources there. So we've got just a few more minutes. What else do you want to say, Peter? I know there's things in your head.
Oh, there's always things in my head, isn't it? And if they're interesting or not. I think, it's important not to be alone. Mm-hmm. I think COVID showed us that. Amen. We're still kind of hanging over from that. But I think another thing about the center is that you got these people that wouldn't otherwise have met. Mm-hmm. And people with the right heart. Not that our hearts are perfect, but that have a heart for the city and the heart for others. Only good things can come when you put them together.
Amen.
I mean, there's already the relationships I've built. Things are coming out of that. I've connected people. I've realized I can only really help people in three ways, other than what I do for work. I can encourage them. Someone called me a Barnabas once, which was very nice. I'm not sure I'd go that far. Son of encouragement is what that means. Right. I can give them ideas. Right? Most of my ideas aren't very good, but occasionally there'll be one in there that's helpful. And connections. Yep. I love to connect people. I love to bring people together. And just yesterday, I had a call from a friend who wanted to thank me for a connection. It just filled my heart. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of good reasons to not be alone. Right. And I think particularly men are really bad at not doing that.
Yeah.
And they carry a lot of the burdens themselves that they don't need to. And there's other people out there that are going through what they're going through. And believe me, everyone has the same problems, really.
Right.
It's everywhere.
Right.
And so coming together, whatever that looks like, accountability group, some kind of Center for Faith and Work, mentorship, relationships, whatever it is, you got to do this with other people.
Yeah, love that. Good. How about you, Kirsta? Any last words of wisdom?
Yeah, my last words of wisdom are that what you do matters,
Amen.
and whatever
Yes.
that is. So you may not be called to justice work. You may not be called to business. You may not be called to education.
Right.
You may be called to something entirely different. But in that space, God is going to use you, if you allow him, to make the connections with the people that he is putting into your space. And just know that whether you're struggling with your work, it's okay. Because your work is going to make a difference in the life of someone else, and you in that space can make a difference. So that's my encouraging word
I
for
love
the
that.
day.
What we call vocation, right? Serving neighbor, loving God and serving neighbor. That's what we get to do. And what a blessing this conversation has been. I thank you, both of you, for what you do for me personally, and more importantly, what you do for the greater Austin community as you go about your work, leading lives of faith and making a difference in the world. And so thanks for this conversation. Thanks for the time. I look forward to further conversations.
Well, you don't get away with it, Kristi.
Oh, yeah?
What are your last words?
Oh,
of
goodness.
advice? Put you on the spot.
I think building on what both the two of you said is recognizing that our vocational callings are ever evolving, ever unique, and it's unique as it evolves, right? Our vocational callings, and just to be grateful for the opportunity that God has created us uniquely, that God has gifted us with gifts, and that in those gifts we get to serve people with other people. And you mentioned, Peter, so many people don't seem satisfied in work. And maybe a lot of that is because that sense of gratitude or that sense of understanding that this is how I serve in this job, we don't develop that theology of work. And so what a privilege it is to be able to think about these things, to be able to engage in conversation about these things and do the work together.
And I know you finished, but let me say this thing. This is it. There was a time, and I hope this is helpful for someone, if it stays in. As I said, there was a time where I thought, this isn't going to happen for me. And I lamented being me. I thought that I had to go start a multi-billion-dollar business, otherwise I was useless. That's what God's called me to. No, now I get to support dozens of entrepreneurs, right? And so it took me a while, and I'm still struggling with it, that it's okay to be me. In fact, I'm made that way for a reason. And so I love what you just said, because that's difficult for people, I think, sometimes.
Thank you for tuning in to Leading with Faith. If you enjoyed these conversations, we invite you to share this with others who might be inspired by these leadership insights. Until next time, continue to lead with faith.